Hi there, and welcome to the Great Talks with podcast. I'm Dani, and today we talk with Gladys Molina, who is the Executive Director of the Young Center organization. If you haven't heard of them, the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights protects and advances the rights and best interests of immigrant children that come to the United States from all over the world. Their goal is to change immigration system so that children in immigration proceedings are recognized as children and best interests are made a part of the decision-making process. If you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we learn how we can help to secure children immigration rights in the United States. Hi, Gladys. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Dani. Great to be
here. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us today. Well, I would like to start by leveling down the ground for everyone, because when I was reading your mission statement, a sentence popped out to my mind, and I'm going to read it again. And I think that's the core of our conversation here today. You state that your goal is to change the immigration system so that children in immigration proceedings are recognized as children. This is something that I think is very hard to fully understand. So could you please explain to us a little bit more about the situation? What exactly does that sentence mean?
Yeah, it means that our immigration system, Dani, we think of children being the subject of immigration proceedings and thinking of them as children. The immigration system in the United States, as most immigration systems around the world, they were designed and implementation around those designs is around grown-ups migrating. I don't think many of us imagined a world in which children would be crossing borders on their own or would be coming with parents and then be separated from their parents. And the mission of the Young Center is that when we are dealing with immigrant children, that we deal with them first and foremost as children rather than as immigrants, and that we take the sensitivities of what it means to be a child, even if they happen to be a migrant, into mind first and foremost, and that we look at what the domestic welfare system has to offer in the United States when a child is detained for their protection or because there is custodial issues to be sorted out between a parent and the child protective system. And that we look at the protective measures in place for children in our foster care system, where a child is provided an attorney and their best interests are taken into account whenever an agency or a judge is making decisions about where a child lives, how a child is cared for, and whether a child gets to return to their home. That we employ that same model when we're making decisions on the immigration side, when it comes to deciding where a kid should be placed if they're going to be detained by the US government. What services should a kid have and what information should a kid have while they're in the custody of the US government? And what factors an immigration judge should take into account if a child is to be returned to their native country before they migrated to the United States? That's what we mean by that. That's what in the background of our vision and our mission is sensitizing the immigration system to the fact that we're dealing with children and not grown-ups.
Thank you so much for that, because I confess that it's hard for me to, being from a different reality, to actually understand how cruel that can be and how real that is actually, right, for the children going through the process. So also, can you guide me through a little bit about what are the steps that a child faces when he or she is detained by the immigration enforcement, just so we can have a broader picture of it?
Yes. So when a child, two scenarios can play out when a child comes to the United States. One is they come on their own, meaning they enter the US without a legal guardian or a parent with them. And in that situation, we call them an unaccompanied minor. And when they get apprehended by Border Patrol, by the officers in green uniforms that work for the US Department of Homeland Security, the Border Patrol agents take them to a station. They usually pick them up in the desert or around the river in Texas or in the arid desert in Arizona. And they take them to a Border Patrol station where they're detained. They're in government custody at that point. And it's a cold place where there's high air conditioning, in part because these Border Patrol stations are located in South Texas and Southern Arizona. And there they get processed. And what we mean by processed is they get fingerprinted, their pictures are taken. And I mean, even if you're a 6-month-old or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old, your picture is taken. And if a child has a piece of paper in their clothes or somewhere that can identify a person in the United States that they have contact with, Border Patrol can contact that person to get more information about the kid. But essentially, the point of processing the child is to gather information so that Border Patrol can then file a case with the immigration later down the road to explain why this kid doesn't have the right to be in the United States and then pursue a deportation case against the child. In those Border Patrol stations, the kids can only be there legally up to 72 hours, and then they have to be transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where they will be placed while they undergo their deportation proceedings. And also they can see if a sponsor in the United States can sponsor them out of immigration custody. So it's a 2-part process: is processing by Border Patrol, and then it's being cared for by the Office of Refugee Resettlement while they undergo their immigration proceedings, or they find a way to be sponsored in the United States so that they're not in detention, they're not in government custody while they finish their deportation case.
Oh, it's really not meant for kids at all. I mean, it sounds cold, it sounds strange and very tricky, right? You have to follow and know the rules and know the laws. So really, I had no idea of that. And in that context, what is the work that you have been able to do at the Young Center?
Yes. So after a kid gets transferred to the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they're often placed in shelters around the country or small foster care groups or homes. And the Young Center from that setting then gets referrals from social workers that work with the kids, or counselors, or legal service providers, the attorneys that go in to these shelters to provide legal rights presentations or legal intakes or legal representation for the kids. Or a judge. We can also get a referral from an immigration judge. And essentially, those social workers, attorneys, judges can refer cases to the Young Center so we can provide child advocacy services on behalf of the child. Now, what do we mean by child advocate services? Essentially, it means to have an advocate assigned to that child to make recommendations to the different decision makers, meaning the immigration judges, the immigration customs enforcement agents, and the attorneys that work for immigration and customs enforcement, the shelters where social workers and clinicians, counselors come into contact with kids, and the immigration attorneys that represent the kids. For all of those parties to have recommendations from the child advocate as to what course of action or decisions invested in those roles, invested in those stakeholders, can best serve the best interest of the child. So the Young Center comes in to make those recommendations and communicate those recommendations to those different stakeholders surrounding the child when the child is in detention.
Right, so it's a way to give some security to the child and security to the process, so that little person doesn't have to go through it alone, right?
Yeah. And the process of, yes. So it's the role essentially, serves two intentions, two purposes. One is to make recommendations and make best interest determinations to the different decision makers. But it is also one of accompanying the child, of seeing the child, hearing the child, being there for the child as they sit in the circumstances that they're in government care and custody, and for them to have the information that they need to make decisions under the circumstances that they're in. And in that, we see tremendous power in walking with kids and accompanying them and sitting with them through what they're going through and bearing witness to that phase of their lives.
Wow, that's truly a wonderful thing, I think, because I keep imagining going through that alone, and it must be terrifying. And when you say best interests, I would like to know more what's taken into consideration when you think about that, because not always the best for the kid is to go back, but not always the best is to stay. So how is that measured?
Yes, that's a beautiful question, actually, because I like to center the answer and to just look at your own life. As a human being, yourself, you, Danny, anybody else, you have interest in your life. You have security interest. You have pleasure interest to pursue hobbies, to play sports, to watch a movie, right? The liberty to do that. You have financial interest to make sure that you can pay your rent. You have a job. You have developmental interests to pursue your dreams, your creativity. You have spiritual interests to pursue yourself and your wholeness as a human being. Children are no different. Children have the interest of permanency to make sure that they have a permanent home in which they feel like they belonged and are loved and are cared for. They have the interest of making sure that they can develop, that they have access to education, access to services that they may need to meet their needs. And they also have the interest of liberty, to be able to explore the world, to be able to express themselves and their different identities. So when we say of children's best interest, it means that we're looking at their family permanency, that we're looking at their ability to pursue the freedoms and the opportunities that are best for them, and that they're surrounded by loving individuals that are going to help their development along. So when we say we make recommendations around best interest, what that looks like is us saying this child should be reunified with a sponsor, because for them, being with that loving sponsor, whether it be a family friend or a family member, is going to allow them to thrive and present their best immigration defense in immigration court, as opposed to being in detention. That's what that looks like for us when we say we make best interest. But I like to always ground people in that every human being has interest in their lives, and children are no different. They just take a different form from our grown-up interest because they're little persons. But that's what we mean by best interest of children.
That's great, and it's a very interesting and powerful list of things. I'm really happy to hear that. And one thing that I looked into your website and found is that you have also a huge commitment on changing or reforming the immigration system for children, right? And what exactly happens, or not what, how that happens precisely? What is the process to change things?
Well, we do it in two ways. So we're both an advocacy organization that advocates for systemic changes, and then we're also a service organization that has services for the children, for the immigrant children that we are here to serve. On the advocacy side, our policy team works with the heads of agencies that oversee immigration courts and makes recommendations to them about systemic changes that they can make to accommodate the needs of children and to have procedures and systems in place in the courtrooms to acknowledge the fact that children are going through removal proceedings. And it's not just a physical space and a procedural space that is set up for grown-ups, but that we remember that we're also dealing with children going through those proceedings. So from our advocacy arm in the organization, that's what that looks like. From our services side, as we provide child advocate services to the children, we make recommendations in those specific cases for the immigration court. And so on the advocacy side, we're looking at systemic changes and looking at the big picture and still pushing for changes that makes sure that the system sees children for the unique traits that they have. In the individual cases, we're also doing that, but on that individual case, and reminding the judge, this child is 5 years old, or they have this history of trauma, or this testimony will trigger the kid. So let's be careful around the questions that are asked in this asylum hearing. So in those individual cases, we are still doing the big picture, meaning like, let's be sensitive to the fact that we have small children in these proceedings, but we're doing it in an individual case. And by advocating for that big picture change and reminding the system in individual children's cases, our whole intention still remains to shift the immigration system in a way that it is more sensitive and more responsive to the needs of children.
Thank you so much for explaining that to us. And just getting to the close of our interview here, I'd like to know if anyone listening to us right now would like to help your efforts. What are the best ways to engage in that fight?
Oh, good question, Danny. So we're always in the need of volunteers because our child advocate program depends on volunteers that donate their time to meet with kids and get to know them and hear them and see them. So one of the things I would ask is that people go to our website, theyoungcenter.org, the Young Center, as in the young and the old, theyoungcenter.org, and look at our tab on how to get involved. And if you know of anyone who speaks Spanish and would like to be a child advocate volunteer, or speaks other languages too. Sometimes we see kids from India or China, and so we also have need for those languages. But if you know somebody that would like to be a child advocate volunteer for us, direct them to our website, or you yourself may go there and you can donate your time to the Young Center. We're always welcome people to donate their financial resources so that we can grow our services and do more as an organization, especially for our systemic advocacy on the policy side. And thirdly, you can also run for the Young Center. We have a Waymaker race coming up in September that folks can sign up online and do the race at a time that is convenient for them. So that's another way that they can support us and just overall champion the rights of children, right? And whenever you get that opportunity to share a message of a story that you see or an organization that is working with youth and children that are migrating from one country to another, to uplift those efforts and uplift those voices.
Thank you so very much, Gladys. This was a great talk.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We have the pleasure to talk to you and learn a lot about this subject today. And also thank you for everyone who's listening to us right now. If you enjoyed this episode, please press subscribe on YouTube in your podcast app. That will show the algorithms that this is an important conversation and more people can learn about the importance of children immigration rights and the work that's been developed by the Young Center.